By 9 o'clock in the morning, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the greatest army he had assembled in 3 years. By 9 o'clock that evening, his empire was gone forever. In one afternoon, across a rain-soaked Belgian field just a few square miles wide, the fate of Europe was decided. Not by gods or prophecy, but by one catastrophic miscalculation, and a man's refusal to admit defeat. This is the real story behind Waterloo, not the myth or legend, but the brutal, chaotic truth of how the world's most dangerous man destroyed himself in under 12 hours. I have always said that God was on the side of the heaviest battalions. At this point in history, Europe had been at war for over 20 years. Napoleon had conquered most of the continent, redrawn borders, and toppled dynasties with terrifying ease. He was not only a general, he was a force that had reshaped the modern world. But in 1814, the coalition of European powers Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia finally broke him. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba. Europe exhaled. The wars were over. They were wrong. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped. He landed in southern France with just 1,000 men and marched north. The French king, Louis XV, sent soldiers to arrest him. Instead, they joined him. Within 3 weeks, he was back in Paris. The Allied powers declared him an outlaw and mobilized 700,000 soldiers to destroy him. Napoleon understood the math perfectly. He could not fight all of them at once. His only hope, his one narrow path to survival, was to strike fast, divide his enemies, and knock them out one by one before they could unite. And so, on June 15, 1815, he crossed into Belgium. What happened next would reshape the balance of power for the next century. Napoleon's strategy was elegant and brutal. Between him and the Channel stood 2 armies, the Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher and the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington. If they united, he was finished, so he drove a wedge between them. On June 16th, Napoleon's army fought both enemies. At Ligny, he crushed the Prussians so thoroughly that Blücher was thrown from his horse and nearly killed. At Quatre Bras, Wellington's forces barely held. The plan seemed to work. Napoleon bloodied both armies and needed to finish Wellington before Blücher could recover. But here is what history books don't always explain. Napoleon made a fatal error that day. He sent his marshal, Emmanuel de Grouchy, east with 30,000 men to follow the Prussians and prevent them from rejoining Wellington. It sounded like good generalship. It would prove to be his doom. But Blücher was not finished. Despite wounds and defeat, the 72-year-old marshal refused to retreat east. He turned his battered army north, toward Wellington and Waterloo. The morning of June 18th broke gray and wet. The battlefield south of Brussels, a shallow valley between ridges, was pure mud. Confident, Napoleon delayed his attack until noon to let the ground firm for his artillery. That delay would cost him everything. Wellington had positioned his army with characteristic shrewdness on the reverse slope of a ridge, hidden from French artillery, waiting. His force of 68,000 men anchored its positions on critical strongpoints. The chateau of Hougoumont protecting his right flank, and the farmhouse of La Haie Sainte standing firm in the center. These were not decorative positions, they were fortresses, and the French would bleed for them all day. At 11:30 am, the battle opened with the French assault on Hougoumont, a diversionary attack that was supposed to take minutes. It lasted the entire day. The defenders, mostly British and German guardsmen, held the farm through wave after wave of French infantry. Thousands of men died fighting over a courtyard gate. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon launched his grand assault. 80 guns opened simultaneously. The earth shook. Then came the infantry, massive columns of veterans surging uphill through cannon fire and musket volleys. Then, around 4 p.m., Marshal Ney made a catastrophic tactical blunder. Mistaking a realignment of British troops for a general retreat, he unleashed wave after wave of nearly 10,000 French horsemen uphill against unbroken British infantry squares. They broke on those squares like water on stone until the valley below was carpeted with dead horses and riders. It was only after these tragic, unsupported cavalry charges that the French finally captured the farmhouse of La Haie Sainte at around 6 p.m. With the center exposed, the Allied line was genuinely buckling. By early evening, Wellington admitted he had never been in a closer run battle. His line was exhausted, ammunition low, every reserve committed. He was waiting, holding on by discipline and stubbornness alone. Then came the sound every French soldier had been dreading all day. From the east, from the direction Grouchy was supposed to be watching, came the thunder of Prussian guns. 30,000 fresh Prussians attacked Napoleon's right flank. The exhausted French, outnumbered and fighting on two fronts, began to crack. Napoleon played his last card. The Imperial Guard, his elite veterans, never before broken in battle, meant to shatter Wellington's line. The Guard advanced. Wellington's infantry rose from the reverse slope, firing point-blank into the column. The Guard faltered, stopped, and impossibly turned back. When the French saw the Imperial Guard retreat, collapse followed. The cry spread, "La Garde recule." Within minutes, the French army was in full route. The consequences were immediate and absolute. Napoleon fled the field. He abdicated 4 days later. By October, he was on a ship to Sainte Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, from which there would be no escape. He died there 6 years later, 51 years old. The human cost was staggering. In one afternoon, about 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. For years, farmers plowed up bones with every harvest. History would never be the same. The Congress of Vienna, already underway, redrew the map of Europe and established a balance of power designed specifically to prevent another Napoleon from ever rising again. It would hold remarkably for nearly a century. But who truly won at Waterloo? Wellington received the glory. Yet it was Blücher's Prussians marching through the night on shattered legs, fighting on despite defeat 2 days earlier, who actually saved the day. History, as always, is complicated. 200 years later, we still search for this story. Because Waterloo is not just a battle. It is a parable about the limits of genius, about what happens when ambition outruns wisdom, when a brilliant mind refuses to hear the word enough. The modern map of Europe was drawn in the aftermath of Napoleon's wars. The very concept of nationalism, the redrawing of German and Italian borders, the future revolutions of 1848, all of it flows from the world Napoleon shattered, and the world the Congress of Vienna rebuilt. And there is a darker lesson here, one that echoes down through history. Napoleon lost not because Wellington was smarter, not because the odds were impossible, but because he delayed 3 hours on the morning of June 18th. 3 hours for the mud to dry, 3 hours that let Blücher march, 3 hours that ended an empire. The lesson is brutally simple. History turns on the smallest decisions, and those who forget that often end their days on distant islands, dictating memoirs to anyone who will listen. Napoleon once said that history is simply a set of lies agreed upon. But here's what is not a lie. On June 18, 1815, a single afternoon of mud, blood, and miscalculation brought down the greatest military empire the modern world had ever seen, and the world it created, for better and for worse, is still the world we live in today. If this story gripped you, if you want more deep-dive history that goes beyond the headlines and the myths, hit like and subscribe.